Crippled Masters. They are Frank Shum and Jack Con, featuring also the yoga grandmaster Ho. You'll see it all in The Crippled Masters, coming soon to this theater.
Chaz Kangas here for Speak Minneapolis on a very exciting occasion. Severin has just released two classic martial arts films, and they've looked better than they have in decades. I'm referring to, of course, the legendary The Crippled Masters and the Za Karate collection. And joining me today to speak about this historic release are two absolute experts in the field, the great Michael Worth and Frank Djeng. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, no, pleasure. Appreciate that.
Yes. So with these films being the history they have with them, and I think for everyone with an interest in the genre, like we encounter them and as longtime fans through, of course, the channels we've had to go through to see some of these movies. Both of you, do you recall your first time seeing either of these films?
I'll speak real quick about that. I saw The Crippled Masters at the Lux Theater in Oakland. And I was a little kid, back then you'd got to go see it in the afternoon because mom wanted me home by dinner. But I remember the theater was absolutely packed. And every move that these two guys, the two stars, Frankie Chung and Jackie Chan, as they were sort of released in America as, did something, the theater blew up. I mean, I always remembered that going, wow, this is amazing. So, and as for Za Karate, I was a big fan of Japanese samurai films as a kid too. And so this was a nice sort of crossover of sort of almost martial arts plus samurai. And first time I saw it was actually on TV. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for me, actually, I saw both on video, unfortunately. I didn't have the luxury of seeing them in theaters. But I just remember seeing Crippled Masters, just looking at it as just like a regular martial arts film. I wasn't really, either surprised or shocked by the fact that, you have two guys with no arms and no legs. As I just felt as the film progressed, it would just look like any other martial arts film from that period. And I kind of watched it like that. Za Karate, actually, saw on video, and I thought they were just great fun. Tadashi Yamashita, and I remember seeing Bolo Young, and all these other martial artists in the film. And I had a great time watching it. But yeah, I saw both on video, not in the theater.
So, yeah, my first experience with Crippled Masters was seeing the trailer of it. I think the trailer itself is a rite of passage at some point for any martial arts fan, at least. And I was taking a martial arts cinema class at NYU. And we, at that point, because this was 2007, so a lot of times we had to use fifth, sixth generation bootlegs to see some of the films that weren't quite as readily available. And even then, like, the only copies we could find of Crippled Masters were unwatchable, when it looked like a film has been shot on a telephone that's been underwater for a few decades, it went past the limits. So, but having to always want to see it, and then now to finally see the beautiful release of it. So being it too, Crippled Masters, I believe this is the worldwide disc premiere, like in any format. So why do you think for a film that has had such a tremendous cult following from not just the martial arts world, but just the cult cinema world, the psychotronic world, why has it taken so long for it to finally get any sort of disc release?
I will say real quickly that one of the things is that these films in general are not well, I mean, it's changing, I think, over the last few years. But when I went to Severin years ago, they had been doing such great work with these German and Italian horror films, and so when I went in there to meet with David Gregory, one of the co-founders, I said, look, there's this whole entire untapped market of Bruce Lee exploitation films, particularly that I grew up on, but kung fu films in general that people love, and they're all scrounging on these cropped, non-anamorphic, fifth generation YouTube videos to watch it. And as a director myself, I know what goes into setting up compositions in terms of how, you want to try and pull in a certain impact to a shot or whatever it is. And it's all lost on what you were talking about, where you're like scrounging for these terrible copies. So luckily Severin kind of got the bug a little bit, and a year after I'd sort of pitched this idea to them, they called Frank and I up, and Frank had been working with them previously, and we went off to Hong Kong and started doing this documentary, Enter the Clones of Bruce. that was specifically about the Bruce Lee exploitation era. But as we were doing this, David's eyes started to open up to this vast array of films like The Crippled Masters, like Zakarate, that had yet to be touched in terms of being released in an appropriate format. And as you probably noticed on the Zakarate front, I think it was part 3 has never seen a release in any form, even in the U.S. So it's great to be getting this. This is the stuff that I've been hoping to have done for many, many years, and I'm glad it's happening.
Yeah, and also I think it has to do with basically the recent renaissance of these classic, martial arts films, particularly from Hong Kong, done by mostly actually the UK labels. I felt that it was a UK label that kind of started this new wave of these classic, retro, martial arts film on video presented in like, great video and audio with special features and stuff. And I think that wave kind of came over to the US. It started out a few years ago in the UK, and now it kind of came over to the US, and so that's why we're seeing more of these classic, old school, martial arts films that are being released by boutique labels like Severin and other labels because of that way. Because people are now, aware of how great these films are and how good they can look when it's properly presented in its original aspect ratio, color graded, restored, and all that. And I think that's probably, I think that is what led to this current wave of these release of these classic, old school films on these, on labels like Severin.
Yeah, Zakarate, I think in particular, there's so many just beautiful shots that are forever going to be burned in my mind now with how good they look, whether it's the teardrops falling on the table or, the sword in the storm at night, just which in previous releases, like you didn't quite get the majesty of what was being on screen. And I'm using the term releases kind of loosely. Some of these things are more escaped than they released, it seemed, in some of the quality. But seeing it now and how just tremendous it appears, it's wild. And a lot of these things probably, haven't, it certainly hasn't looked this good since it was in theaters. And with theaters in mind, with Crippled Masters being the history it had with playing the Grindhouse, the 42nd Street circuit, the drive-in circuits in the States. And I think, I don't recall ever reading about a screening of it in the United States that didn't somewhere include the words hootin' and hollerin', just with the reactions to it. So, but curiously about Crippled Masters, what do we know about its impact on the rest of the world in other markets when it first was released?
Well, I mean, look, I can tell you, and Frank might have some ideas about that history of it too. But from my point of view, there was one of the things. There's a famous quote that's usually attributed to Alfred Hitchcock, which is that when you have limitations, is where you get creativity. And so the idea of taking two actors, one having the not use of his legs, what was it, thalatomyopathy syndrome? I can't remember the exact term, but the guy with no arms, Frankie, and getting them together to create a new sort of choreography, I think was brilliant. You could look at it and say, oh, they just kind of did this for sort of exploitation idea. But if you watch the film and you pay attention to the story, it goes beyond the two of them together. I mean, we've got both a physical and an emotional sort of unity they need to form because they're both enemies at the beginning of the film. So they got to overcome that. They are brought together by a man who happens to be a contortionist. So you got two guys with problems with their limbs being trained by a guy who's got this incredible, adapted limbs, right? And so, I mean, there's so much to this film from this story level that takes it well beyond the sort of wildness, as Frank was talking about. It's just like a regular martial arts film, but being forced to be more creative with your action choreography. And this is 1979, 1980. So you're just getting into this phase where martial arts films were beginning to really rely heavily on actual martial artists over just actors trying to pretend they knew martial arts, which was more or less begat by Bruce Lee and back in the early 70s. So anyway, I think for me, it's just one of those examples of that genre of film that was beginning to get go beyond the traditional and start playing around with some of the boundaries, and I think in that way it really affected. And there were a couple of sequels to this with the same two actors that followed up. So it's definitely had success, and Frank might know a little bit more about the success financially.
Yeah, well, this was basically a Hong Kong finance production shot in Taiwan with Taiwanese cast and crew, but it was never released in Hong Kong. Ironically, it was released in Taiwan in 1980. It only ran for 1 week. Box office was unknown because at that Taiwan has never been, at that time at least, Taiwan was not as good in keeping records as like Hong Kong does. So we never, in my research I could never find out exactly how well it did in Taiwan. Because back then they used a very rough way of calculating box office. They would just get all the box office figures from theater and then kind of do a divided, average them out, and then that's the box office. That's pretty much it. So, but technically you can say there was more or less a Taiwanese film financed by a Hong Kong company. Essentially, it's still a Hong Kong film shot in Taiwan. It actually was released in U.S. back in 1982 by none other than New Line Cinema, who of course brought us the Lord of the Rings films, and then it was actually a double feature where Bruce Lee Enter the Dragon in New York's famous 42nd Street Cinema, and was shown there for quite some time. It will end up playing different U.S. markets over the next 2 or 3 years since its initial release. It was actually quite popular in Europe, of course. These films always do well in Europe, particularly in France and Germany. In France, it was actually called the Kung Fu Monsters. In Japan, it's called the Crippled Heaven. But like Michael said, once the film's novelty wears off, once you start watching the film, you see, Frank has no arm, Jack has no legs, then it becomes really your very traditional martial arts film. But it actually have quite a few elements that I really like. For one thing, Michael mentioned the fact that the master, the Sifu, and the master was a contortionist, but he also actually has a nefarious purpose in recruiting them. He wants those jade things, those jade horses. It's actually for his own selfish good that he recruited these two guys to teach them kung fu so that they can get this stuff for him. It's almost like doing it for personal purposes, not really for helping them. Initially you think, you think this will be your regular plot of master teaching these guys to seek revenge, but no, master is doing it for his own good. And also, the other thing that I find most interesting about the Crippled Master was the villain, the guy who they eventually fought, has a disability of his own. He's a hunchback, and it's almost like he, so you have this interesting setup where the two disabled heroes are also fighting someone that in a way is similar to them. Where we never found out exactly why he had a hunchback. Was it part of his kung fu? Something happened to him and all that? Was it the hunchback that led to him being this bad guy? But I just find that very interesting that you even the villain himself is not a normal, a physically normal guy. He has his own handicap, and they have to fight him. And like Michael said, the choreography itself is actually very interesting, because how do you choreograph fights where you have to involve one guy with no arms and one guy with no legs? And I think that alone makes the fight in this film particularly interesting to watch, because it's not really something that you see in your regular martial arts film. And I think all these elements actually make this film a rather unique kind of martial arts film in its own right.
Yeah, and to speak to that point, as well as a point about how the traditional martial arts film it is, you really see the overcoming of obstacles and the breaking down to the level to finally reaching the goals, and it's shown in such a unflinching, and the way it's shot too is I wouldn't call it exploitation or a full-on exploitation thing either. I think it's based on, whether it's the poster or the trailer, it often gets pigeonholed and mislabeled. I think it just so happens to be this film that stars two differently abled but tremendously talented martial artists, and then with having the antagonist be, with the hunch, and then as we see with the eye as well, it just really, it's so very ahead of its time in that regard.
And also, one thing that I find it kind of odd was this film was often associated with bruceploitation, but it's not a bruceploitation film. And I think that's because when it was released in Europe, I think Germany, I believe, they used a tagline on one of the posters with the words bruceploitation on it. And so you see have a bunch of German words, tigre, tiger, whatever. And all of a sudden you have a bruceploitation word. And again, it's not a bruceploitation film. And I also don't look at this film as a so-called, freakploitation or cripploitation. Is really a kung fu film through and through, like Chaz just said, with your typical narrative and character. It just so happened our two leads are disabled. So.
Yeah, and then I'm if I recall correctly, Crippled Avengers came out prior to this, right?
Yeah. And which of course,
yes.
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
of course featured two able-bodied fighters. But yeah, you're right. It does
And
get a
also
little
feature
mixed up.
actual actors who are not disabled or who are not crippled. They pretend to be crippled. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So is Crippled Masters the like as far as we know it's could and I could be off on saying it's the most famous, but were there many other films with differently abled bodies, martial artists that came out in the wake of this after the success, or is it really kind of other than the sequels and the other films starring these particular martial artists, is it kind of the only one of its kind?
Well, you kind of have to go back to the one-armed swordsman films, because you have the
But
Jim
again,
Wong.
that wasn't a real one-armed guy. So we're
Yeah,
yeah,
but of
yeah.
course, again, yeah, that wasn't a real one-armed guy. So
Yeah.
if you're asking whether there were any other martial art film that feature actual disabled, handicapped, crippled, no.
Yeah.
I think these two were it. But I mean, I think this film is really the only one that features actual martial artists that are disabled.
Nice. So, when working on this new version of Crippled Masters and knowing it is a film that has such a reputation behind it for so many different reasons as we discussed. How do you feel like this new version fits within the legacy of the film?
Well, I think it's one of the parts about that that's for me that's always interesting is trying to really understand what the film looked like when it came out, and I think trying to find the colors that might have been more because today we live in a high definition world. So there's this sort of belief like let's make everything super clear and super bright and super saturated and John Wick. And that's not really exactly what they always looked like back then. You pay attention to the stock like Fuji stock or whatever was used, and you knew what colors were tended towards on those particular in those particular movies. And so what Severin's great about is they're not trying to overdo it. They're not trying to gloss things up and make them look waxy and so perfect. It's fine. It's finding that balance of what was the original intentions of the director, of the producers. What did the film look like, and trying to bring it back to that space. And I think Crippled Masters are the way we did the transfer and the scan and the color grading. I think it came out really, really good, and I'm really happy with it. Sometimes some are a challenge. We luckily had some good film elements that we were able to use to draw from. But that's part of the fun for me. The research is me going back and trying to understand what film stocks they shot on. Can I find like any kind of an original trailer that may have survived like as a film and watch it and see what color the trailer was and try and match it to that. But I think they did a really good job with it. So I'm
Yeah,
really kind of happy about
Michael.
that.
Michael brings up a great point. Like whenever we work on these films, we always try to be faithful to how it looks, how it sounds, and I'll give you an example. I recently worked on a Dragon Lord, the Jackie Chan film for a UK label, and the opening sequence. If you've seen the film, you remember the opening sequence had this big chase of it, the bun situation, the competition where they have to climb up this bun mountain and try to grab the buns and stuff. And that sequence has always been kind of grayish, and very the color's always like saturated or faded, and it's not very rich in color. And so when we were working on the remastering, we were on the color grading really, and we were talking about, well, how should it look? Is that really how it looked? And so I actually went and asked the assistant director, Angie Chan, who worked on the film, who was there when they shot that whole sequence in Taiwan. And I showed her how it looked originally and how we were looking, we were working on the color grading, and she said, "Well, I remember it was sunny," and so because of what she said, then we try to strike a balance between how it looked originally in theaters and how it should look, and that's what we strive for. Whether if somebody who worked on a film, we can if we can reach out to somebody who worked on a film, we'll actually reach out to the person and ask them for their opinion before really finalizing how the film looks on the video. But yeah, that's always the goal, to make it look just I felt that like sometimes the remastering of these films are so good now. It looks like it was shot yesterday, particularly the 4K titles. But sometimes there's also advantages in having a film like Crippled Master that still has a little bit of this like grindhouse quality that kind of reminds you of how it looked back on 42nd Street. So, but the main thing is to present it in the best way possible, and also to present it like that's how it should look.
Definitely. And so, speaking of things that are looking amazing,
And the other thing is you got to keep. Oh no, go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
No, go ahead. Absolutely, go.
I was going to say one of the things you have to keep in mind too is when many of these films were coming out, particularly in the 70s before the 80s, this is before the home video market. So a lot of these films were very transient in nature. They just figured, well, we're going to get a couple years out of it and then it's gone and we'll throw it into the ocean. People like Shaw Brothers had a little bit more, they were a little bit more like, careful about their film elements, etc. But many of these independents were just like, this will be here today, gone tomorrow. And so we would go when Frank and I and David went back to Hong Kong and Taiwan. We even brought one of the directors, Lee So Nam, who's done a number of these independent films, to one of the Taiwan Film Institute to watch one of his films. What they had in their locker, in their carefully curated locker, and we started watching it. And I always remember Lee So Nam looking over at us, going, "Terrible." And it was just so bad and so chopped up. So it is a mission on a lot of people think when they see us releasing these films, they're like, well, why don't they do the best quality, or why can't they find the complete version or whatever it might be? And you have to understand, once you get the right stuff out of the way, you're out looking for film elements that actually can work. And we're oftentimes Frankensteining films. I found we have this one film coming out. I had to go find a print in Italy at a movie theater, and then another print we had to find from some chopped up version from somewhere in the US. And so there's a lot of involvement trying to get the absolute, as Frank was just talking about, from finding the best elements to, if anybody's still alive technically that we can talk to, directors, cinematographers, even colorists if possible. What did the film really look like? So it's like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Kung Fu movies.
Absolutely. And then, you mentioned with Zakarate 3 not having, and this being the first full release of it, for years and years, the urban legend, or maybe that's elevating it too much, the misnomer about it was that it was the Bronson Lee champion was just Zakarate 3 re-release, which, as we know, is completely not true by having all four films on here. So even decoding through the legend, the lore, the myths, the mythos, the misinformation, like, in the Indiana Jonesing and piecing these puzzles together to then finally bring these things back.
Yeah, yeah, and they were trying to do a Zakarate 4 with Sonny Chiba, and then it did morph into its own movie, but they were doing a series, much like Zatoichi, or, that kind of a thing. They were going along Lone Wolf and Cub. They were making a series out of these things. So
Yeah. So with the Zakaratis, how was it working with the commentary and the interview and the extras with Sensei Yamashita?
Oh, you watch the interview on the disc, you'll see what a character he is. And a lot of people, most of their connection to him is obviously the Octagon or, American Ninja from us in the US anyway. But I mean, he goes way back, and he comes from and his martial arts are like, they're really elevated to this great level. So when you watch Zakarate, you're seeing him at, I think, his peak. And it is much like Sonny Chiba. It's an acquired taste because it's very eccentric, it's very over the top, it's very intense, and he did all the choreography on it. So it was really great. Again, like, Frank and I we just came back, actually, Frank and I, from Hong Kong and Taiwan, because we're trying to get out there and talk to these guys as much as possible, who are now in their 70s and 80s and even getting close to their 90s, to get their perspectives. And luckily, Tadashi, is still very vibrant. And so we were able to pull him in we did 3 commentaries in a row with him. So he sat there for all 3 movies, and we just did the whole thing, and getting his input was like one of the dreams of mine. And I love the Japanese films. The Japanese films have their own flavor that it does differ from the Chinese martial arts films. So, it's and back in the 70s, I mean, Shaw Brothers and different Chinese films were very influenced by these Japanese films, as well as the spaghetti westerns, which you guys were noting in the Crippled Masters. You can see a lot of spaghetti western in there. But the filmmaking in the Japanese, so you were talking about the shots. There's certain shots that, I mean, those guys are critical artists. Anyway, so yeah, it was a lot of fun working with him and finding out, some of the processes of shooting that film that does differ from how they would do them in Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Yeah, and the commentaries, hearing him talk about how great his hair looks, because seeing it now in these remasters, and that was the first that jumped to me, like, amazing head of hair on that man. And so It's so many things that these new versions offer. So, one thing I really like about the collection is that you have both the Bronson Lee champion and you have Zakarate and its original release on there. And I watched both back to back. I started with the Bronson Lee champion version because I think that's kind of what if you're gonna do both back to back, you can't take away. You want to like be given more to it, and just having the chance to like watch both on the same disc, and it really kind of just speaks to how much a film can change and these things go around. So, what do you think about watching both of these films next to each other? How it speaks to the different markets of their release at the time?
Well, I think it's always and there's some Chinese films that are like this, that not as many, I think, that fluctuate, but it was true of a lot of I mean, you can go to the Godzilla movie, the original Godzilla from 1954, when they added Raymond Burr and sort of gave it its own spin. And I think with Bronson Lee, it's the same thing. You watch the Japanese version, and it comes from that cultural perspective. I mean, there's clearly things in there that will get, cut out or taken out because A, they don't think the international audience will get it, or maybe it doesn't support the sort of cowboy mentality they were pushing, which is a great part of both versions. Bronson Lee's kind of coming in with his cowboy hat, and he's playing like it's an interesting take of a Japanese but raised in America coming back to Japan, and that was from a Japanese perspective, and they play that up at least how they see how maybe a Japanese raised in America would be coming back. And so, yeah, I think for people that are interested in just not only the history of the films or from a martial arts perspective, from a cultural perspective of like, we're talking about, what is it now, 40 some years ago or whatever, maybe it was even longer. My mind's getting a little bad with the numbers, but I mean, I'm seeing perspective in that, how people were altering these films to make them more maybe palatable to somebody of a different audience, international or otherwise. But I mean, I love both versions. Don't I mean the Japanese version for sure is like, I think, stands out for me as my favorite, but there is just something fun about watching how they morph into their own second version.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think too having the American version, the he fought in Vietnam thing they throw in there, that's just not in the. It feels like, oh, this must be of the time, so you immediately know. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yep, you're right. That's exactly it. And that's what I mean. It's like that idea of Vietnam, even though it was prevalent in Asia, obviously, you had all this sort of effects of it there. But for the American effect of this sort of, the prideful American fighting in Vietnam, coming back and getting spit on or abused, they were working that in because there were a lot of movies at that time, the sort of anti-Vietnam movies that were coming out at that same era. So it fit right into that.
Yeah. So with Zakarati, you have the inclusion of some of the world's absolute best martial artists in their different styles, like in real life, absolute experts in these sort of styles. So when you have them being able to be on film like this, do you think films like Zakarati, in addition to just being tremendous martial arts entertainment, also serve as a accurate time capsule of the masters of these disciplines at the time?
Yeah, and I think Frank might have some ideas on this too, but I mean, many of these guys that they were using were actual martial artists I mean, most of them weren't actors. They were brought in as martial artists. That we were in this period of time where showing martial arts. I mean, look at the title of the film, Zakarate. It's like we're making a martial arts movie, and so of course it's its own blend of hyper realism brought in to make it work. But you're dealing with all these different styles coming from different parts of the world, and so, yeah, if you somebody who grew up as a martial artist, I mean, doing it myself, watching a film like this was great because you could study the systems and see how, karate or taekwondo or, some of the more American styles. And then they had the kung fu versions. They brought bolo in, as Frank was mentioning, to sort of represent the more, Chinese. I mean, so it was great. It's very much along that traditional, of that hyper manga anime sort of mentality of Japanese filmmaking, of just everything was extreme. So I wouldn't say it's one other point about it that from that perspective of what you're talking about is there's a lot, especially in the first film, a lot of the combat sequences are presented in a very tournament sort of fashion, which was rather than it being all, fight scenes on top of buildings and falling downstairs, it was very much traditional competitive karate against karate, and even the camera angles themselves were oftentimes placed more objectively, as if you were an audience member watching it rather than always coming in for a close up. It was like you were watching it as if you were sitting in an audience watching this competition. And I thought that was really interesting about the film as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact is, Bruce Lee changed everything. Prior to Bruce Lee, all these films, the quote unquote martial art films, which are mostly wuxia films, swordplay films featured actors, actors doing martial arts moves. They're not really martial artists, but because of Bruce Lee, everyone, audiences want to see actual fighting on screen. Even though, look, to be honest, when you see martial artists fighting on screen, those are just film fighting, and they're not really, there's actually very little physical, actual, contact. But the thing is, people want to see actual martial artists in these films after Bruce Lee, and so that's why you have actual martial artists. And that's why they were looking for actual martial artists, not just for your regular film, like of course we talk about Sammo Hung, Wang Yi and all that, but also for the Bruceploitation films. All the Bruceploitation films, all the leads in the Bruceploitation films were actual martial artists. Bruce Lee, Dragon Lee, they all had martial arts foundation. They all trained in martial arts. So it's not like they just it's not like they're just looking for people who look like Bruce Lee. They're looking for people who not only look like Bruce Lee, but also can fight. And that's almost all the martial art films that you were watching throughout the 70s, and until of course Jackie Chan came along with the action comedy stuff. But yeah, so Bruce Lee really kind of changed the landscape of these films to the point where they have to find someone who's not only charismatic on screen, they also need to actually know how to fight.
Spectacular. Well, thank you so much for your time today and the wisdom we can pass along further, and for further immortalized on this. And congratulations once again on your work on both the Crippled Masters and Azat Karate, both available now from Severin.